Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm hoping that we have a good conversation today on integrative medicine and medical cannabis. First, I like to definitely thank Davis Dream Foundation for the invitation, and very proud to be part of the organization, and definitely that we should continue to support it, as well as to thank obviously to the supporters of the event as they're detailed below. What we're going to be talking today is on integrative oncology and medical cannabis. We get asked as a medical oncologist probably on a daily basis about this topic. So I think that it's quite important. I don't have any relevant conflicts of interest. I do belong to the Davis Dream Foundation, and we're going to be fairly short and simplistic. We're going to be talking about what is integrative medicine, what the limitation of the integrative medicine is, and then we're going to learn a little bit about cannabis and medicine. Now, you got to be careful because there's a lot of irresponsible people working on these fields, and that's what I'm going to be also discussing a little bit, and hopefully be able to entertain some questions regarding the topic. So the first thing is that it's kind of like well known for many years that the body has an innate capacity of healing, and that's part of the reason that we always consider as some of the Greeks used to say, Galen, that was one of the fathers of medicine. He used to say that the physician is only nature's assistant, and then more recently, Sir William Osler has said that treating just the disease is definitely not the way, that we need to treat the patient. So that's a little bit of what is integrative medicine, but I'm going to start with the definitions. The National Institute of Health has defined, and they do have an institute of complementary and alternative medicine as a group of diverse medical and healthcare system practices that are not presently considered part of what is conventional medical care. And at the National Institute of Health, the complementary and alternative medicine promotes the study of a lot of these interventions. Now, we don't like the term alternative. Part of that is because alternative means that we're not doing the standard of care. And this is a place that I saw one day, and I had to snap a picture of an alternative funeral home because there's several studies, like the graph that it's detailed on the right and the slide, in which you can see that the patients that use just alternative medicine have a lower survival than the patients that receive standard of care treatments. That's the reason that we really talk much more of integrative medicine that I'm going to discuss in a second. Now, part of the problem of all this is that we're spending a lot of money in this country in medicine, and we're not advancing as fast as what we should be for the amount of money that we're spending. So sometimes spending more does not mean spending smarter. So let's get back to integrative medicine. What integrative medicine is the use of all appropriate therapies, both conventional and alternative, to facilitate the body's innate healing response. And integrative medicine neither rejects conventional medicine or accepts alternative medicine uncritically. So that's actually part of the point, that we need to use everything in a judicious way that allows, at the end of the day, that inner healing to occur within each one of us, um, in an effort to promote cure when it's there. Now, you would ask, like, why would people use complementary and alternative medicine? And we've done studies of this. We've looked at the rationale of why people may be using a treatment that it's not accepted as conventional medical care. And you can tell that complementary and alternative medicine may be seen that it's interesting, because sometimes when we talk to patients about cancer therapies, the patients feel that our therapies would not help. And sometimes, as I was showing you on the medical expenditures, because the treatment that is conventional may just be too expensive. Now, you see that uh, a lot of alternative therapies have been even sold on the side of the roads. Latril, that was one of the alternative therapies, or vitamin B17, was seen in shops around towns and all that. And that's not where we want medical care to be delivered. We want medical care to be delivered at the medical office. And also, we see that a lot of times, um, things that could be vilified, that people think like, this is crazy, why are you considering even this, end up coming into the conventional medical world. This is a picture of Dr. William Cooley, that was one of the promoters of immunotherapy of the beginning of the century, of the 19th century and 20th century. The idea was to promote the body immunicity to try to fight the cancer by itself. And Cooley's cocktail for many, many years was vilified. People used to say that that was complete craziness. And actually, the two people that are next to Cooley in this picture, Dr. Ehrlich and Dr. Metchnikoff, actually won the Nobel Prize for some of the work, and Cooley was vilified. Nowadays, we use immunotherapy for gastric cancer on a daily basis, and we are getting back into discussing why Cooley's cocktail may have been useful. Um, so a lot of different topics that we're going to be talking. Part of the other thing that is always important when I'm talking to patients about uh, uh, complementary and integrative medicine is that there's a lot of legal implications. That when you see things in the different stores, in the different practices of even non-medical practices, and they say like, oh, it's FDA approved. Well, you gotta be careful, because that's not completely legal and it's not completely settled. And this is just a case precedent of the Gerson cocktail and the Gonzalez practice in New York, where they were taken to a court of law. And they even said that even if the patient comes to my office and they tell me like, no, I do want you to do this alternative therapy, I'm not exempt of providing the best medical care. And that's actually something that we need to be careful, that a practice that it's allowing a patient to dictate their own medical care may not be completely within the legal realm. And the second thing is that the FDA is just an overseeing agency for drug and dietary supplements, as well as food. It's the Food and Drug Administration. And the FDA does not completely regulate how apples are sold in this country. And when a supplement is sold at a store, the FDA may consider that supplement part of food, not drug. And that's the reason that it may not be regulated in the same fashion. What is supposed to be happening is that the Federal Trade Commission regulates the marketing and advertising, and they should be the enforcing agency, but there's no manpower for the amount of dietary supplements and things that could be said. But still, that's part of the reason that when you see a lot of things in the store, they may say it's FDA approved, but it because they approve it as if it would be just a food. Now, there's a lot of practices, and this is just a list that I came up to one day while I was kind of like traveling, of things that my patients use, and that I get asked about when I wear my integrative medicine hat. I did a 2-year fellowship on integrative medicine, and that's the reason that I also see occasional consultations on integrative medicine instead of just the regular medical oncology practice. But at the end, what you see is that what it should be, it's that it should be mixed with the conventional care, where natural products, nutritional practices, psychological and mind and body interventions are at the same level, and that we put them within the conventional practice, and that we could just integrate them all. Now, a summary of what we're going to be talking for like 20 to 30 more minutes at the most would be nutrition, mind and body practices, manipulation practices, spirituality, energy practices, and at the end of the day, whole body system practices that we're going to be talking a little bit. Let's start quickly with nutrition. So nutrition, I took this slide once that we did a campaign, and the photographer that made this slide allowed me to take it, in which he said that the modern kitchen is like not just to see a regular hamburger that you would say like, well, that's just natural bread, lettuce, tomatoes, meat, and things like that. But when you look at the label of something like a frozen hamburger that you may take out from the store, it may have all those chemical additives that you see there. And as you see on the picture that he said, it said, if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. But the interesting thing is that this year, already for the past 2 years, actually, 35% of all the cancers in the United States may be related to diet. And that's actually surpassing tobacco as the number one cause of preventable cancers in this country. So, tobacco for years and years, decades, used to be the number one preventable cause. Nowadays, diet, and it's both what we eat, but what we don't eat has been the number one cause of cancer in this country. So again, more than one out of every three patients that walked into my office has a cancer that may have been prevented if the patient may have taken action earlier in their life about their diet. And we also know that diet might also work as we are treating already a patient diagnosed with diet. So again, back to a little bit of quotes. Maimonides, that was a famous physician, said that no illness that could be treated with diet should be treated by any other means. And then actually on a separate quote, to show you how um, problematic it is when we talk about diet. As the comedian and a musician actually said, Alex Levine, he said that only Irish coffee provides in a single glass the four essential groups of food: alcohol, caffeine, sugar, and fat. This is the way that a lot of the American patients are saying this. And the problem is that the obesity trends in this country are going crazy. So if we go back in time, and these are maps from the Center for Disease Control from the CDC, in which they have been tracking the obesity in this country. And when you look at 1985, a body mass index, a BMI of more than 30, which means that the patient would qualify for a gastric bypass, was seen in just a handful of states. 10 to 14% of the patients in these blue states, blue, not politically speaking, but dark blue states here, were the ones that had a little bit more obesity. But let's go into uh, just over the years and see how it has evolved. 1986, now you keep seeing how it's increasing, keeps moving, and as we go on, the whole map gets filled up, and you see that now we're already with a change that it's actually 15 to 19% in the darker blue states, and now we have 20%, meaning one out of every five people that I would cross in those states with yellow color would be amenable for a gastric bypass. Morbid obesity. Look at this now, 25% already. 2001. And it only gets worse. It continues to get worse over the years. 30%, one out of every three patients on the darker colored states would be amenable for gastric bypass, meaning that the obesity is morbid, and we keep seeing it evolving to the point that in the 2011 and 2012, the data was changed, and as you can see, um, the map changing. And then more recently, the CDC decided to collect just self reported data. And even on self reported data, we're already with states that are approaching 45 to 50%. Every other person that you cross in the state will be considered morbidly obese. That's the reason that cancer is increasing to these levels, and that's the reason that cancer has even surpassed heart disease and the number one cause of death in this country. But it's also the reason that we have seen a lot of changes in our country. We don't see anymore these stores like big and tall, because now the uh, what we see of this population is just in regular stores. And that's the reason that a lot of times they ask me that what's the biggest problem that I see with cancer in this country. And I said that it's actually the SAT diet, the standard American diet that we have seen in the country. So that's sort of where we are. And part of the problem with the diet is food processing. You see this wheat field, and as the field gets ready for pickup, we pick up the kernels. They're beautiful kernels of wheat that uh, essentially are like you've seen now with all the issues of the Ukraine war and how wheat is one of the staples of food in this country and in all the world. But the more that we process and we go from this nice kernel to a white powder that it's got a very high absorption and very high what we call glycemic index and glycemic load that will allow for the patient to have a higher blood glucose level, higher insulin in the level and in the body, and an increased inflammation and possible tumor promotion. So it's not the same to eat the less processed foods than the more processed foods. And this is something that we continue to see all the time. And that's part of the reason that we always say that food should be part of the medical care. And we definitely think that in the future, pharmacies should be considered even the grocery stores. Now, the problem is that patients tend to try to compensate a bad diet with dietary supplements. And this is a picture that I took of a patient that came to see me on consultation, and they wanted me more than anything to review all the supplements that they were taking. And the patient was having a problem with their calcium level being always extremely elevated. And after reviewing all the supplements, the calcium level was from multiple redundant calcium supplements and vitamin D that were at mega doses that were being actually giving harm to the patient. So you see, at the end, we can say that you should take any reports of disease preventing vitamins as a grain of salt, that when all this is sorted out, it could turn out that we have to take 50 or 60 um, different nutrients to get a real benefit. It's called broccoli. Okay, so that's what we are, cruciferous vegetables, nice of the grocery store, prepared in many different ways, are way better than the supplement by itself. We've done two studies at our institution, the SELECT study and then the CARET study, to see if some dietary supplements could help even for prevention of some of the cancers. And as you can see on this one, that was one of the reports out of the this was the CARET study, on the patients that took some of the beta carotene and some of the different supplements, there was actually an increase in the risk of cancer, not a decrease. Now, you will say, why would that happen? Part of it could be because the supplements could be great as anti-aging. If I want to avoid having wrinkles and things like that, they could work, but they could also prevent the cancer cells that are early in their development from being taken down by the immune system or just having natural causes of death of those cancer cells, and promoting the cancer cells with that advantage of some of these supplements could end up giving the patient um, higher incidence of cancer when they have risk factors such as smoking or obesity. So you have to be careful. On the SELECT study, it was selenium and vitamin E, and it also showed an increase in the risk of cancer. The second problem is that a lot of these dietary supplements do interact with medications. And you can see that this is just a list of the enzymatic pathways that the liver uses to metabolize medications, and just showing some of the dietary supplements how they can interact just like any other medication. Every time that I prescribe a medication for a patient of mine, I check that the drugs that the patient is already taking would not interact with that medication. And you can see that supplements could also have heavy interactions. So you would ask, why are we not doing more botanical research and trying to find this better? And it's not that easy. I've done a few clinical trials of botanicals, but the problem is that standardizing the preparation is not easy, because a lot of times in between harvesting, let's say, that broccoli that we're talking, and then extracting that cruciferous um, components, might not be the same if I harvest the broccoli a little bit more green, less green. How do I extract that? And then you could have similar plants on similar names of the plants with very different plants. So when you were to see, like for instance, ginseng, the uh, American ginseng, Korean ginseng, and Siberian ginseng are actually from different botanical groups in which they're absolutely different. But you may end up finding a study of ginseng alone. And that tells you nothing because the plants are very different. The part of the plant that is being used for research, if I use the leaves, the fruit, nobody will drink wine made out of the leaves of the plant. Everybody will drink the wine drinking the juice of the grapes, but not of the leaves. So you can tell that you could say it's just the same. It's not. And that actually you can tell that, like for instance, resveratrol, which is a derivative of the grape seeds, could end up having concentrations, which is just below there on the list, that are the equivalent. A bottle of resveratrol is being calculated to have the equivalent of 600 bottles of wine. I'm not sure that that's completely healthy. So that takes us also back to the doses. And then when I'm doing research on botanical components, we're doing a clinical trial now of some vitamins in the treatment of colorectal cancer. It's very difficult to control the patients from just going into the uh, store and buying those vitamins. So the placebo group, it's extremely difficult to control. So let's switch gears to mind and body medicine. Mind and body medicine, it's a diverse group of practices that focus on the interactions of the brain, mind, body, and behavior with the intent to use the mind to affect the physical functioning and promote health. And Plato said it, that it is the great error of our day in the treatment of the human body to separate the soul from the body. So we need to know that there is quite a bit of power in our minds, and there's a lot of different techniques. I'm going to talk here about some of them, but you're going to see that, like for instance, the one that is now in vogue, cognitive behavioral therapy, even that by itself, there's many different types. But it's mostly relaxation, meditation, guided imagery, biofeedback, hypnosis, and the studies are plenty. This is just a study that I pick up out of one of our medical journals, not gastric cancer, but breast cancer, in which what they did is mindfulness to try to decrease some of the side effects of the different interventions. And you can see that just mindfulness could decrease the cortisol levels that the patients had in the mornings. Cortisol is the hormone that we measure when we want to measure stress levels. If the cortisol level is decreasing, it means that the patient is decreasing in stress. If the patient is decreasing in stress, it means that the patient is having better quality of life at the minimum. Not to say that they also have decreased hot flashes and decrease of many other symptoms. And when you see a lot of different things, they could go from just body scanning, sitting meditations, yoga, um, a lot of different things. They're very simple. I can tell you that we looked at the how long does it take to train somebody on any mindful based stress reduction. It takes only 10 minutes. So we actually looked at data from the University of Minnesota, in which what they did was to look at Buddhist monks that have been practicing for years and years and then scan their brain while they're undergoing meditation, and then take somebody off the street, teach them 10 minutes of meditation. The effect on the brain on what it's called dynamic magnetic resonance imaging was absolutely the same of the Buddhist monk with years of experience and somebody with 10 minutes of training. So it's not that difficult. We all recommend that. I actually do it with my students, that just to have some mindfulness and meditation. Let's go to a little bit of whole body systems, which include Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, uh, acupuncture by itself, where just like kind of like going into a meridian might end up having an effect that it's much bigger than just the meridian that is being treated. So when you look at uh, those techniques, as well as even therapeutic touch, which is something that is not just kind of like holding the hand of a person that is undergoing care, but that by itself could be an option, but it's something a little bit more trained, the therapeutic touch. You could see that in the experimental groups, when there was therapeutic touch, it was improved. And again, these whole body interventions, some of these things that are done have shown tremendous benefit. You could even say that just intercessory prayer, because when we look at the patients that undergo integrative medicine interventions, we usually exclude prayer of the person that says, there's a big group at my temple, church, mosque, praying for my health. That's something that we usually extract, but we cannot ignore it because intercessory prayer might even have an effect. The question is how, what's the control group and all that, and we don't restrict anywhere. It's part of spirituality, and I can tell you, like, this is one of our therapists at the cancer center where I work, and we have pet therapy. That it was not that easy when I wanted to get pet therapy approved for our patients, and that the pets will come in and be seeing the patients. Some people actually questioned me and they said, well, are you sure that an animal that we don't know if it's clean with a patient that is immunosuppressed because they're getting chemotherapy? And I told them, like, believe me, it's not going to be a problem. We have them, and it's without a doubt one of the things that I do believe that enhances the mood of the patients, um, decreases the amount of stress during chemotherapy or before the radiation that the patients are going to undergo, and it definitely improves. So a lot of these interventions do work. Now, for the end of the lecture, for the last 15 to 20 minutes, let's talk a little bit of medical cannabis. So again, this is just a very short introduction. We have meetings of integrative oncology, only integrative oncology, not full integrative medicine, but just integrative oncology that lasts 3 days. So you can tell that this is just something that we're talking very superficially. So cannabis is not new. Cannabis has been found on the graves of Oriental healers, where in this gravesite of Chinese practitioner of like God knows how many centuries ago, in that little bowl that is next to the skeleton of the practitioner, they found cannabis seeds. They call it in Chinese medicine dama. So this is not new. This is something that has been going for ages. And I can tell you that there's reports of more than 3,000 years. And the first reports in the medical literature come from the 1840s, where they describe it to be an analgesic, sedative, anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, and anticonvulsivant. And it was listed in the pharmacopoeia until 1941. You'll see why it was then taken out. But extracts of marijuana and hashish were the number one, number two, and number three most prescribed medication from 1840 to 1890. It fell out of favor with the discovery of opiates, barbiturates, aspirin, chlorhydrates, and Henry Ansliger, that was a prohibitionist, um, started restricting it in Congress in 1930 or so. The reason initially was that it started to be taxed, and you can see how the recreational use was taxed at 100 times what the medicinal use was. Only the American Medical Association opposed to those restrictions, and by 1942, it was delisted from the pharmacopoeia and restricted completely from future investigations. So you can tell how it went from being the number one medical remedy to completely delisted. And this is kind of like taken actually from the archives of Congress. This is not something that I wrote. I actually quoted because this is on um, the archives of Congress when they were trying to delist marijuana, which the first thing that they did is that they put a Hispanic name at that time to kind of like uh, make it a little bit more into something that people will reject. But they say that marijuana was the most violence causing drug in the history of mankind. Most marijuana smokers were Negroes, Hispanic, Filipinos, and entertainers, and their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from the marijuana use. And this is what it was used to delist marijuana. You could imagine how this would have gone nowadays if it would be listed in the archives of any society. Now, in 1970, the National Institute of Drug Addiction did end up placing marijuana as what is called a Schedule 1 substance. A Schedule 1 substance means that it's a substance of which no medical use exists and it's got a high potential for abuse. Schedule 2 includes substances like opiates, like morphine, in which, yes, they still are addictive, but there is medical use. I'm going to prove you that this is not right and that that's the reason that medical marijuana or medical cannabis should be taken back into the medical practice in a much more rapid way. The federal law continues to enhance this. Okay, so federal law since 1970 has not changed the distinction between recreational or medicinal, and up to this day, they're trying to decrease the federal offenses, but you still could be charged with up to 1 year of prison with the first offense of possessing medical or any type of cannabis, and up to 5 years. Again, it's been tried to be decreased, but by 2001, the Supreme Court actually said that medical need is no excuse to break the law. Okay, so you still have to be careful, and the FDA has affirmed in 2006 that marijuana is not medicine. So we are still very much trying to change it. It is not a completely well understood compound. It's got more than 400 chemical compounds with the highest concentration in the flowers of the female plants. And then delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinoid is kind of like the most important one that will have the psychogenic effect. But there's tons of other ones that have tremendous amount of activity. Nowadays, we're even learning that not even the cannabinoids by itself, but even the terpenes and the flavonoids that are on the flower could be very effective in treating a lot of different things. There's three different plants of cannabis: sativa, indica, and ruderalis. Sativa and indica are the ones that are most commonly found nowadays, either in medical or recreational dispensaries in the states where it's legal. Ruderalis is fairly not seen. Sativa is the one that creates a more euphoric effect. The indica is the one that is the more sedative. But the plant-derived cannabinoids have many names, and at the end of the day, we know that inhalation of the cannabinoids with vaporization or combustion tends to give levels that tend to be predictable and very rapidly metabolized because they tend to have less conversion to what it's called the 11 tetrahydrocannabinoid, which is the problem with oral preparations that could linger longer in the body. So there is a difference. It's not something that we can tell for certain of anyone take a edible cannabinoid and it's going to be the same as inhaling it. I tend to be a little bit more of the proponents of inhaled is better. Part of the problem is because the level of the oral could be degraded much lesser, and the 11 tetrahydrocannabinoid could be lingering in the body for a longer period of time, and that could give us more trouble of a longer effect of the use of the cannabinoid. Now there's cannabinoid receptors in multiple places. There's what we call the cannabinoid 1 and the cannabinoid 2 receptors. The cannabinoid 1 receptor tend to be much more in the brain, in the areas that you can see there, the basal ganglia and all that. The cannabinoid 2 are much more immune mediated, and you're going to see that the immune mechanisms may be a little bit different. Now, I get asked a lot about what dose of cannabinoid to use. It's not completely known. Low doses are considered to be less than 7 milligrams, medium dose is 7 to 18 milligrams, and a high dose is 18 or more milligrams. With time, as the patient uses more, there's an effect that is called tolerance or tachyphylaxis, which means that the person becomes less sensitive to the effect of the compound. It doesn't mean that they're addicted. It just means that the person has less of an effect because the medication or the chemical compound is metabolized a little bit faster by the body. Okay? Nothing to do with addiction. Okay? And that's something that can occur mostly with low and intermittent use, can happen, but it still can be a problem. Now, it has effects in a lot of other parts of the body. Saying that the cannabinoid has mostly receptors in the brain, it doesn't mean that the brain does not control. Again, don't forget what I told you, that the brain can still control the body quite a bit. But the use of the cannabinoids could end up giving, and depending on the preparation, elevation of the heart rate with an average of more than 20 beats per minute increase. Some people may get subjective euphoria as well as decreased alertness and motor instability. It can decrease hormone levels, and that could have some sexual implications for the patient. So using the cannabinoids could also end up giving some of these issues. We don't know for certain that it may interact with the tumors or the cancers that may have hormone dependency. And in females, it can have actually an increase in the level of estrogen as well. So that's sort of where we are. On the immune system, there are early reports that we're starting to see that it's not as much, and this is an oral communication that was shared by Israeli investigators, that they showed that on the patients that use cannabis, the possibility of a response to immunotherapies may be less. We don't know for certain that this is real, very small number of patients, but we are carefully looking at this data because we don't want to decrease the possibility of the patient having a benefit of immunotherapies that we use in this setting. Now, regarding toxicity, because again, as you can say, the FDA still consider it a Schedule 1, meaning very toxic. Uh, it's not. It's not that toxic. And when you see, this is what we call the therapeutic window of marijuana and some of the other psychotropic compounds. And when you look at, like, for instance, the dose of narcotics, heroin, and things like that, versus the dose of marijuana that it will require to create toxicity, it's probably one of the safest compounds that we have in our armamentarium. And besides the hallucination and tachycardia and labor breathing that can happen in some rare instances, it's extremely, extremely rare to have any toxicity, to the point that if you were to look at death rate from a marijuana use, it's close to zero. Obviously, that doesn't mean that a person that is under the effect of marijuana should be operating heavy machinery or driving cars, because there is some amount of decreased alertness, and decreased alertness can occur from sleep deprivation as well. So don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm recommending that somebody uses a cannabinoid and goes and drives, because that's the same that I would not recommend to some people that are sleep deprived to do it, but definitely less than what it can happen from alcohol, and not to say even cigarettes, as we talked earlier in the lecture. So this is where we are. Even dependency, the risk of somebody developing dependency of marijuana or cannabis is extremely low. It's actually quite interesting, because if you see the number of people that have used cannabinoids in their life, it's super super high in this country, especially in the United States. Younger patients tend to use a lot. They are the one of the few that could end up having trouble because there is a rare effect, but that still is present in childs that use cannabinoids. So before the age of, I would say, 16 to 18, where the pleasure center of the brain could be affected, and the person could end up having what it's called medically anhedonia, that is lack of pleasure, that nothing will give them um, pleasure, and that would be a little bit problematic for many, many different reasons, because it's somebody that it could be told uh, that things are going great and they may have no reaction, but the same could happen if they tell them that they need to react in the setting of things not going that well. So again, that only is a very extremely rare side effect in kids at the brain development stages. But the dependency by itself, being addicted to marijuana, it's less than 10%, which is like nothing compared to what you see with alcohol, nicotine, or any of the other compounds. So, where is the evidence? And I did a literature search of marijuana. I think that it was like 2 years ago already. And in the medical literature, there were like 15,000 papers of marijuana, but clinical trials where it was really what we would consider a good evidence on the medical point of view. There were not even 100 papers. But where we have some papers, it does work for nausea. It might stimulate appetite, some preparations, not all of them. Pain relief, I'm starting to believe that it's even less than what we think, that it's not really that much as what we had believed before. Some of the different preparations may decrease muscle spasms and muscle cramps, and for neurologic symptoms such as tics, and even as high as Tourette syndrome, which is a major amount of tics and some other problems, as well as epilepsy. It appears to be the case. This is the research that I told you of 16,000 articles, cannabis and cancer 517, but actual clinical trials just 19. So this is sort of where we are. And again, it is very difficult. When the studies were done by the National Institute of Health of Medical Cannabis, a lot of the patients were getting like stems of the plant, so the botanical dosification was very difficult. And then even dosing the inhalation. How do you dose somebody inhaling more deeply versus less deeply? So we're due to get more data on cannabis. I really think that we need to get much more. And the biggest problem is that it's not pharmaceutical. The two preparations that were available of cannabinoids did well temporarily for HIV and for some of the cancer indications, but as being a compound that is not patented, it's very difficult to get the funding for the clinical research, and to be able to advance the science much more. And the federal government continues not to make it easier. Here in the state of Florida, where I'm based, and where I was one of the first 200 physicians allowed to prescribe marijuana, uh, they asked me that I need to get consent, that it's much more difficult to get than what I need for chemotherapy. I'm giving a patient chemotherapy, which is almost controlled poison, and I need less of all these consent forms than what I need for medical cannabis. So it's actually very problematic. And just comparing, since we talk about nutrition and earlier, you can compare like the carbonated high sugar sodas versus cannabis, and you can see that sodas could end up giving you obesity, lower immune systems. Um, while cannabis is just short-term impairment of alertness, they tend to have highly addictive high fructose corn syrup, while cannabis, as I show you, is non-addictive. Sodas are full of carcinogens, and there's nothing in medical literature that you will find of anyone recommending to drink a soda or a carbonated high fructose drink for any reason. And as I show you, 19 research articles with cannabis, and still is illegal while the sodas are sold in public schools. So this is really a problem. So summary at the end of the day on integrative medicine, and you can put cannabis as one of your appropriate use of supplements, but we need to really control the weight of our patients, have healthy eating, as noted, appropriate use of supplements, keep up with regular activity. We didn't talk much about that, but breathing and stress reduction, as well as connect with family and friends, and definitely engage in spirituality and religion. Um, so you'll see that a lot of times there is not a lot of evidence in what we're talking, but you always need to figure out of that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the risk of the intervention that we're going to do is what should drive the level of evidence that we put on there. So that's the reason that I do still promote some things without complete double blind randomized controlled clinical trials, because they tend to have low level of risk. And again, uh, this is sort of where we are at this time. So I see that there's people joining from multiple places. I see on the chat that there's people from Alabama, Texas, South Carolina, Florida, even Uganda and Ghana, that I welcome them. I actually, one of my botanical research was precisely with a plant from Ghana for enhancement of taste. So definitely, I think that that's something that we're grateful to be able to reach a lot of people. Now, let me go with a little bit of questions that I see on the chat. Jean says that she's having trouble eating cruciferous vegetables due to excessive gas and bloating. So the I wouldn't recommend a supplement instead of the vegetable, again, because the supplement of the uh, cruciferous vegetable by itself may not have all the compounds that we need. We usually recommend to try to counteract the gas by using things like simethicone. Even aniseed by itself would counteract uh, the gas and bloating that the cruciferous vegetables could have. So I would probably not recommend exchanging a cruciferous vegetable with a supplement, but try to overcome the risk of side effects by taking something that could treat what the uh, not so good effects of the cruciferous vegetable may have. I see another question here from Carol that says that trying to eat a nutritional diet, but with no stomach, having a hard time keeping enough calories, and with low carbohydrate diet and low sugar, low volume diet, eating on a different level, what can we recommend? So yeah, definitely the dumping syndrome that can happen from patients that have complete gastrectomies is a problem, and obviously the low sugar diet and low volumes are going to be problematic. I mostly what I recommend on my patients is a fractionated diet, meaning forget about using uh, breakfast, lunch, and dinner as your standard. I always recommend that you go into using uh, 8, 9, 10 meals a day. So that's definitely important, and try to fractionate, keep low volumes, and keep up the diet as varied as what you can. So it's going to be super important. I see another question here regarding CBD with Delta 8 gummies. Delta 8 is good. So CBD Delta 8 has some effects, and it might have an effect even on nausea more than anything. It all depends on what you're using it for. And I wouldn't use CBD gummies just to try to treat the cancer by itself. Definitely, they could help for nausea for some of the side effects. A lot of times, I found the people at the dispensaries, and I usually take field trips when I travel to states where it's legal, the recreational dispensaries, because a lot of times I can tell my patients, listen, if you have a relative in California, you might want to ask them to get you this, or when you go to visit them and things like that. And the salesperson in the dispensaries tend to be fairly knowledgeable, and there's a lot of apps that you can see um, uh, to get the specific preparations that might be beneficial. I see another question here that how can you get your doctor to look into cannabis as part of your medical cancer treatment? It's tough. Doctors are not trained in this. So again, I did a 2 year training in integrative medicine, and I can tell you that I know less about cannabis than what I know of chemotherapy. And I keep reading all the time, but it's tough because the medical knowledge is not out there. But you have to find an open mind doctor that will be able to get you to the levels of what you want to be experimenting on with the treatment, and making sure that it does not harm what you usually will do for your cancer treatments. And another question here about insurance companies covering medical cannabis. It's going to be very difficult. I do think that it's going to need to go through federal regulation, and until we don't see federal laws changing, I don't see it that it's going to be covered. So I really think that it's on the long run. I don't believe that we're going to be seeing this completely decriminalized, depenalized, and accepted into a standard practice. And it's interesting because I remember like easily 30 years ago that cardiologists used to recommend the patients to have a drink for cardiac health, that they will tell the patients like, oh, in order for you to have less stress, just have a drink a night. Nowadays we know that that's not good for cancer. That and part of the reason that it may not be good for cancer is because it may be so good for the heart that the patients live long enough to survive cardiac conditions to the point that they may end up getting cancer. But in the future, we might end up seeing that people would be recommended, like, listen, before you go into your chemotherapy, have a puff or two of a cannabinoid preparation for you to feel better. But it's going to be a long time before we see that happening. So with that, I think that I will conclude all the questions. I am uh, super glad to be able to join. I think that this was an amazing time to be able to share uh, with everybody today, and definitely, hopefully, we'll have more sessions on these topics. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for joining for the people that are seeing us live on the Davis Dream Foundation platform as well as Facebook.